Marry me instead of my daughter. That's what the desperate widow begged the giant cowboy right there on her porch with dust in the air and the town watching. He rode in to claim a bride, but not the one who met him at the gate. What she asked broke every rule, stirred every whisper, and lit a fire no prayer could put out. There's more at stake than hearts, land, honor, and something hidden in the past no one dares speak of. Now, with the railroad closing in and the church bell counting down, only one question remains. Will he take her hand, or leave her to lose everything? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The spring sun cast long shadows across Jericho Pass as Silas Boone guided his horse down the town's dusty main street. His broad shoulders and towering frame earned him sideways glances from townsfolk going about their morning business. The week-long ride from Trinidad Crossing had left both rider and mount covered in a fine layer of prairie dust. Silas noticed how conversations hushed as he passed. Women whispered behind raised hands, and men nodded with knowing looks. Everyone seemed to recognize him, or rather, they thought they knew why he'd come. The giant of Goliath Ridge, here to claim young Clara Johnson as his bride. The letter in his pocket crinkled with each step of his horse. He'd read those words so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. Sweet, gentle words that spoke of shared dreams and quiet understanding. Words that had given him hope for a new beginning. "Reckon that's him," a shopkeeper muttered to his neighbor. "Come for the schoolmarm's girl?" Silas kept his eyes forward, letting the gossip roll past like water off a duck's back. The mile ride out to the Johnson homestead gave him time to settle his thoughts. The early spring grass was just beginning to green, and meadowlarks called from fence posts along the way. The sod brick house came into view, smoke curling from its chimney into the crystal-clear morning sky. A neat vegetable patch stretched beside it, with early peas already climbing their poles. Everything spoke of careful tending, of a home well-loved despite its modest means. He hadn't made it halfway to the house when the door flew open. A woman rushed out, not the young lady he'd expected, but one closer to his own age. Her dark hair was streaked with silver, and her eyes held a wild desperation that made him pull his horse up short. "Mr. Boone!" she called out, her voice breaking. Before he could dismount properly, she'd fallen to her knees in the packed earth of the yard. "Please, marry me instead of my daughter. Please, I'll explain everything." Silas felt like he'd been struck between the eyes with a hammer. "Ma'am," was all he could manage. "Come inside," she said, already pushing to her feet. "There's coffee on the stove. You'll want to be sitting down for this." The interior of the house was as neat as its garden. Sunlight streamed through clean windows onto a scrubbed wooden table. A pot of coffee bubbled on the iron stove, filling the air with its rich aroma. Abigail Johnson's hands shook as she poured 2 cups. "The letters," she said, setting his cup before him. "I wrote them. All of them. Not Clara." Silas stared into the black coffee, watching steam rise in curls. The words took their time sinking in, like stones dropping through deep water. "You wrote them?" "Yes." Abigail's voice was barely above a whisper. She gripped her own cup like it might anchor her to earth. "I know it was wrong, deceiving you that way. There's no excuse for it. But I was desperate. Desperate enough to play with a man's heart?" The words came out harder than he'd meant them. "Clara's future." Abigail's voice caught. She drew a steadying breath. "She's half Cherokee. Most folks around here, they see that before they see her gentle spirit or her quick mind. I thought if I could secure a good match." "So you chose me?" Silas asked, his tone softening despite himself. He'd seen enough of the world to understand the fear that drove such actions. "You have a reputation for fairness. The way you treated the native families near Trinidad Crossing, word gets around." Abigail's eyes met his, bright with unshed tears. "But I was wrong to deceive you. Clara doesn't even know about the letters. She's sweet on a young man from the mission school, a Comanche preacher's son. Silas took a long drink of his coffee, letting its warmth spread through him. The letter in his pocket seemed to burn now, knowing it held someone else's words entirely. Yet something in Abigail's face, the mix of shame and fierce maternal love, stirred memories of their brief acquaintance years ago, before her marriage to Johnson. "Why ask me to marry you instead?" he finally asked. "Because the deception was mine alone to bear." Abigail's hands steadied as she spoke. "And because I remember the man you were, before I chose the safer path with Thomas Johnson. I remember your kindness, your strength, if there's any chance of making this right." She trailed off, leaving the offer hanging in the sunlit air between them. Silas sat in silence, watching dust motes dance in the golden beams streaming through the window, feeling the weight of past and present pressing in around them both. Silas strode across the open prairie, his boots crushing new spring grass with each heavy step. The morning's revelation churned in his gut like spoiled meat. Behind him, the Johnson homestead grew smaller, but he couldn't bring himself to mount up and ride away completely. Something held him there, maybe the memory of different letters, or perhaps the haunting look in Abigail's eyes. The sun traced its arc overhead as he walked, letting the wind and silence clear his thoughts. Prairie flowers nodded in the breeze, purple and yellow dots against the awakening grass. A red-tailed hawk circled above, its cry carrying across the empty space like a question without an answer. As evening approached, Silas made his decision. He wouldn't flee like a coward, but neither would he rush into anything foolish. He gathered dry wood and made camp within sight of the Johnson fence line, close enough to see lamplight glowing in their windows, but far enough to keep his thoughts his own. The night air grew crisp, and coyotes sang in the distance as he tended his small fire. Sleep came in fits, broken by memories of those letters. Words he now knew came from a different hand than he'd imagined. Yet somehow, that knowledge didn't sting quite as sharply as it had in the morning. Dawn found him walking back to the homestead, his mind settled on a path forward. Abigail was already up, feeding chickens in the yard. She stilled when she saw him approach, holding her breath like she was bracing for a storm. "Mom?" he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I've done some thinking." "Mr. Boone." She set down her feed bucket, wiping her hands on her apron. "I wouldn't blame you if you'd decided to ride out. That wouldn't be right by anyone." He squared his shoulders. "I reckon we both need time to sort this proper. I propose a week, 7 days of work and prayer. Let's see what the good Lord reveals before making any lasting choices." Relief softened Abigail's features. "That's more than fair, more than I deserve, truth be told." "There's hay needs cutting in your south field," he observed. "And that barn roof could use some attention." "We've got a cot in the barn," she offered. "It ain't much, but it's dry and clean." "That'll do fine." They settled into an uneasy rhythm throughout the day. Silas worked the fields, his powerful frame making quick work of tasks that had long needed a man's strength. Abigail kept to the house mostly, though she brought him water and a midday meal. They spoke little, letting honest work fill the space where words might have tangled things further. As evening approached, Abigail called him in to supper. The table was set for 3, though Silas hadn't seen Clara all day. The aroma of fresh bread and beef stew filled the small house, making his stomach remind him how long he'd been working. They'd just sat down when the front door opened. Clara Johnson stepped inside, stopping short at the sight of Silas at their table. She was a striking young woman, with her mother's dark hair but distinctly Cherokee features that spoke of her father's heritage. Her quick eyes took in the scene, noting the tension that crackled in the air like heat lightning. "Mama?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "What's happening here?" "Clara, this is Mr. Boone," Abigail began. But Clara shook her head. "I know who he is, Mama. Folk in town have been talking all day. They say he's come to—" She trailed off, looking between them with growing understanding. "We'll speak after supper," Abigail said firmly. The meal passed in awkward silence, broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. Afterward, Silas excused himself to the barn, knowing mother and daughter needed privacy for what was to come. Through the barn's wooden walls, he could hear their voices rising and falling like wind through prairie grass. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone told its own story: surprise, hurt, confusion, and finally, something like acceptance. Later that night, as Silas was settling onto his cot, the barn door creaked open. Clara stood in the doorway, her face composed but her eyes bright with emotion. "Mr. Boone," she said, stepping inside. "Mama told me everything, about the letters, about her offer to you. I'm sorry you got caught up in this, Miss Johnson. I never knew about any letters," she continued, "and I'm grateful things worked out as they did." She twisted her hands together. "You see, my heart already belongs to another, though I haven't told Mama yet who he is." Silas nodded slowly. "Your mother was trying to secure your future." "I know." Clara's voice softened. "She's carried so much worry for so long, but I never needed her to arrange my life that way." She turned to go, then paused. "Mr. Boone, thank you for not being angry with her. Some men might not have been so understanding." After she left, Silas lay on his cot, listening to the night sounds of the prairie filtering through the barn walls. The situation was far from resolved, but at least now all the truth was laid bare. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight he had peace enough to sleep. The next days settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Silas worked from sunup to sundown, his massive frame moving with purpose across the Johnson homestead. The steady bang of his hammer echoed across the prairie as he replaced rotted boards on the barn roof, each nail driven true and strong. Down below, Abigail kept to her own tasks. The wooden bucket creaked against the well's rope as she drew water, making countless trips between house and garden. The scent of fresh bread drifted from her kitchen window, carried on the spring breeze along with the smoke from her cooking fire. They worked in parallel, like two horses in harness, each aware of the other's presence, but maintaining a careful distance. When their paths crossed, they exchanged only necessary words about chores or meals. Yet there was comfort in the silence between them, filled with the honest sound of work being done. Tuesday passed, then Wednesday dawned clear and mild. Silas was up on the barn roof, replacing the last few shingles, when he spotted a cloud of dust approaching from town. The rider's black coat marked him as a man of the cloth, and soon enough, Reverend Matthews, the circuit preacher, drew his horse to a stop in the yard. "Good day to you," the preacher called up, shading his eyes against the sun, his weathered face crinkled with a smile. "Mighty fine work you're doing up there." Silas touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Afternoon, Reverend." Abigail emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Reverend Matthews, what a pleasant surprise. Won't you come in for some coffee?" The three of them gathered around Abigail's kitchen table, steam rising from tin cups. The preacher's eyes moved between Silas and Abigail with obvious pleasure, misreading their situation entirely. "It does my heart good to see a proper courtship," he declared, beaming. "The Lord surely smiles upon such matches, built on respect and shared labor." He raised his cup in blessing. "May your future together be blessed with joy and abundance." Color rose in Abigail's cheeks, but she didn't correct him. Silas studied the grain of the wooden table, acutely aware of the awkward moment stretching between them. The preacher continued, oblivious to their discomfort. "I've come to spread word about the revival meeting. 2 weeks from now, right here in Jericho Pass. We're expecting folks from 3 counties around." He drained his cup and stood. "I trust we'll see you both there." After the preacher rode away, the house felt different somehow. His words hung in the air like dust motes in lamplight, impossible to ignore. That evening, after supper was cleared and Clara had gone up to bed, Silas and Abigail found themselves still at the table, as if by unspoken agreement. The lamp cast soft shadows on their faces as Abigail broke their usual silence. "I reckon there's something else you should know," she said quietly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "About Clara." Silas waited, giving her space to find her words. "She's not mine by birth," Abigail continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "My Thomas. He was a scout for the army, working with the Cherokee nations. Clara's mother was a Cherokee woman named Morning Star." She drew a shaky breath. There was no impropriety. Morning Star's husband had been killed by raiders, and she and Thomas grew close during his time there. When she died of influenza, leaving a tiny baby behind, Abigail's eyes grew distant with memory. "Well, I couldn't let that child be alone in the world." Silas watched her face in the lamplight, seeing past the worry lines to the young woman who had opened her heart to another woman's child. "You raised her as your own?" he said softly. "Yes." Abigail's chin lifted slightly. "Some folks whispered, of course, but she was Thomas's daughter, and that made her mine too. When he passed 5 years ago, I promised him I'd make sure she had a secure future." Her voice caught. "That's why I wrote those letters, not just for land or protection, though Lord knows we needed both. I wanted her to have a good man for a husband, someone kind and honorable." The lamp flickered, making shadows dance across the walls. In that gentle light, Silas saw Abigail differently, not as a desperate widow who had deceived him, but as a mother who had chosen love over convention, who had raised another woman's child as her own, who had carried the weight of responsibility alone for so long. "That took courage," he said finally. "Taking in a child not your own, facing down the gossip." "It wasn't courage," Abigail replied. "It was love, pure and simple, the kind that doesn't stop to count the cost." They sat in companionable silence then, the night sounds of the prairie drifting in through the open window. The truth between them felt different now, cleaner somehow, like the air after a storm. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Clara packed a small carpet bag. Her movements were quick and purposeful, like a bird preparing for flight. Abigail stood in the doorway, watching her daughter fold a clean shirtwaist and tuck it carefully among her other belongings. "Denver's a fair piece away," Abigail said softly. "You're sure about this?" Clara's hand stilled on the bag's clasp. "I need some time to think, Mama. Cousin Sarah's been asking me to visit since Christmas." She didn't meet her mother's eyes, but her voice held a note of something more, hope, perhaps, or secrets not yet ready to be shared. Abigail crossed the room and touched Clara's cheek. "There's someone there you're wanting to see, isn't there?" A blush colored Clara's face, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a folded paper, yellowed with age. "I found this while cleaning Papa's old trunk last summer. I think you and Mr. Boone should have it now." Silas, who had been quietly drinking his morning coffee at the table, looked up as Clara approached. She handed him the paper with careful hands. "It's Papa's will," she explained. "He never signed it, but his intentions are clear enough. He named you as my legal guardian, Mr. Boone, if anything happened to him and Mama." Her dark eyes held his steadily. "He must have trusted you a great deal." Silas unfolded the document, his weathered fingers gentle with the fragile paper. Thomas Johnson's familiar scrawl filled the page, laying out his wishes for his family's future. The words naming Silas as guardian were there, plain as day, though the bottom of the page remained blank. Thomas had died before making it official. "I reckon that's why Mama wrote those letters," Clara continued softly. "She remembered Papa's trust in you." Silas carefully refolded the will and set it aside on the table. The weight of Thomas Johnson's unfinished business settled heavy on his shoulders, but before he could speak, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders appeared in the yard, their mounts kicking up dust in the morning light. The man in front wore a fine black coat despite the warm weather, and his horse's tack gleamed with silver trim. The two men flanking him wore working clothes and hard expressions. Silas rose from the table, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between the riders and the door where Abigail and Clara stood watching. The man in the black coat dismounted with practiced ease. "Mrs. Johnson." His voice carried the polished tone of Eastern schooling. "I'm Merritt Bow, agent for the railroad. We've discovered something quite interesting about your property." Abigail moved to stand beside Silas. "What might that be, Mr. Bow?" "There's an aquifer running beneath this land, quite valuable to our expansion plans." Bow's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We'll need to see your documentation of ownership immediately." "This land's been in my husband's family for 15 years, Abigail replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Bow's smile thinned. "Then producing the proper papers shouldn't be any trouble, should it?" He gestured to his companions, who had begun to circle the yard like wolves sizing up prey. "We can wait while you fetch them." "The lady doesn't fetch anything for men who come making demands," Silas said quietly. His tone was mild, but something in it made Bow's men stop their circling. Bow's facade of politeness cracked slightly. "This land will be seized for railroad use unless legal ownership is proven by week's end. That's not a demand, sir. It's railroad policy backed by territorial law." "Threatening a widow on her own property ain't any kind of law I recognize," Silas replied. He took one step forward, and though he made no aggressive move, his sheer size seemed to fill the porch. "I reckon you boys ought to ride back to town now. Come back with proper papers and proper manners, or don't come back at all." The two men looked to Bow, who studied Silas for a long moment before mounting his horse. "Friday," he said sharply. "Have the documentation ready, or we'll return with the sheriff." He wheeled his horse around, silver tack flashing in the sun. They watched the riders disappear down the road, dust settling in their wake. Clara clutched her carpet bag close, face pale with worry. "Mama, maybe I shouldn't go." "No." Abigail turned to her daughter, forcing a smile. "You go on to Denver. Mr. Boone and I will sort this out." She hugged Clara tight, then stepped back. "The morning stage will be leaving soon. You don't want to miss it." After Clara had gone, Abigail sank into a kitchen chair, her strength seeming to leave with her daughter. "All our papers were lost in the flood 3 years ago," she said quietly. "Everything but that unsigned will." Silas looked at the folded document on the table, Thomas Johnson's last, incomplete attempt to protect his family. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes something was enough to build on. Abigail knelt before Thomas's old trunk in the corner of her bedroom, her trembling fingers working the brass latch. The musty scent of aged leather and memories wafted up as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay the remnants of her husband's life, his Sunday suit folded with care, a worn Bible with pressed flowers marking favorite verses, stacks of letters tied with faded ribbon. "There has to be something," she whispered, carefully removing each item. Her hands moved with increasing urgency as she searched through the trunk's contents. A packet of land receipts emerged, but they were water-stained and illegible, casualties of the flood that had nearly taken their home 3 years ago. The afternoon light grew dim as she reached the trunk's bottom. Nothing. No deed, no proof of ownership, just the unsigned will that Clara had found. Abigail pressed her forehead against the trunk's weathered edge, fighting back tears. Outside, Silas's boots creaked on the porch boards. "Miss Abigail?" His deep voice carried through the open window. "I'm heading into town to send some wires. Won't be gone long." "Thank you, Silas," she called back, quickly wiping her eyes. The sound of hoofbeats faded as Silas rode toward Jericho Pass. In town, he tied his horse outside the telegraph office, ducking his head to enter through the low doorway. The operator, Ben Wheeler, looked up from his clicking machine. "Afternoon, Mr. Boone. Got a message to send?" "Need to reach Judge Marcus Hayes in Dodge City." Silas said, pulling out a pencil and message form. Served with him in the army. He's practicing law there now. Ben nodded, watching as Silas's large hands carefully wrote out his message, asking about homestead rights and unsigned wills. The telegraph key clattered to life, sending Silas's words racing across the prairie to his old friend. The sun was setting when Silas returned to the Johnson homestead. He found Abigail sitting on the porch steps, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. The trunk's contents lay spread across her bed inside, yielding no answers. "No luck with the papers?" he asked softly, settling beside her on the steps. She shook her head. "That unsigned will is all we have left of Thomas's wishes." Her voice caught. "It won't stop the railroad from taking everything." Above them, the first stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the evening sky. A cool breeze carried the sweet scent of prairie grass, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. Silas studied his hands for a long moment before speaking. "There might be another way," he said carefully. "A legal marriage would strengthen your claim to the homestead. As your husband, I could help defend your rights to this land." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide in the gathering dusk. "Marriage? To me?" Silas nodded slowly. "It's a practical solution. Would give us better standing against the railroad's claims." "Practical," Abigail repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. She stood, wrapping her arms around herself as she paced the porch. "I couldn't ask that of you, Silas. I've already deceived you once with those letters. To trap you in a marriage of duty—" "It wouldn't be a trap," Silas interrupted, rising to his full height. His voice was gentle but firm. "And it wouldn't be just duty." Abigail stopped pacing, her heart thundering in her chest. "What do you mean?" Silas stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring in the growing darkness. "I mean that marrying you would not be a burden, Abigail Johnson. Those letters might have brought me here under false pretenses, but these past days—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've seen your strength, your dedication to Clara, your unwavering faith despite everything. Any man would be blessed to call you wife." Tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks. "But how can you forgive what I did? The lies I told?" "The same way I hope to be forgiven for my own mistakes," Silas said softly, "with grace and understanding." He reached out, gently brushing a tear from her face. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight. Take tomorrow to pray on it. Whatever you decide, I'll respect your choice." Abigail caught his hand before he could withdraw it, holding it against her cheek for a moment. "One day," she whispered, "I'll have an answer for you tomorrow night." Above them, the stars continued their ancient dance across the heavens, witnesses to yet another story of hope growing from desperate soil. The whippoorwill called again, its song carrying across the prairie like a prayer. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pastor Gilroy's front garden as Abigail and Silas walked up the narrow path. Yellow daffodils nodded in the spring breeze, their cheerful faces a stark contrast to Abigail's nervous expression. She smoothed her best calico dress with trembling hands before Silas knocked on the white-painted door. Sarah Gilroy, the pastor's wife, answered with flour-dusted hands and a welcoming smile. "Why, Miss Johnson, Mr. Boone, what a pleasant surprise. Do come in." The parlor smelled of fresh-baked bread and leather-bound books. Pastor Gilroy looked up from his Bible study, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the morning light. "Silas, Abigail, what brings you both here today?" Silas cleared his throat. "We've come to inquire about the marriage process, Pastor." Sarah Gilroy's eyebrows rose, but she kept her composure. The pastor set down his Bible and folded his hands. "I see. And you're both certain about this decision?" "Yes," Abigail said softly, her voice stronger than she felt. "We'd like to marry by week's end, if possible." Pastor Gilroy nodded thoughtfully. "I can perform the ceremony on Friday afternoon. The church will be empty then, and we can have 2 witnesses present." They discussed the details over cups of Sarah's strong coffee. By the time they left, everything was arranged. But as they walked down Main Street, Abigail noticed the sideways glances, the sudden hush of conversations as they passed. At the Mercantile, Abigail went inside alone to purchase supplies while Silas tended to their horses. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and 3 women near the fabric counter fell silent. Their eyes followed her as she gathered items: flour, coffee, sugar. "Well, if it isn't the clever widow," came a sharp voice. Martha Whitaker, her face pinched with judgment, stood blocking the aisle. "Quite a feat. Stealing your own daughters intended." Abigail's hands trembled on the flour sack. "You don't understand." "Oh, we understand perfectly." Martha's voice carried through the store. "Must be desperate times indeed to resort to such methods of securing a husband." The other customers pretended not to listen, but their ears were keen. Abigail set down her basket, tears burning in her eyes, and fled the store. She didn't stop running until she reached her wagon, where Silas caught her arm. "Abigail?" What happened? She couldn't speak, could barely breathe through her shame. Silas helped her onto the wagon seat and drove them home in silence, his jaw tight with concern. That evening, after the supper dishes were cleared, they sat before the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as Silas added another log. "Want to tell me what happened in town?" Abigail stared into the fire. "They think I've seduced you away from Clara, that I'm desperate." Her voice caught on the word. Silas turned to face her, his expression serious in the firelight. "Your worth isn't measured by their gossip, Abigail. Never has been." "Isn't it?" She wiped at a tear. "I'm a widow who deceived a good man with false letters. Maybe they're right about me." "No." Silas's voice was firm but gentle. "You're a woman who sacrificed everything to raise another's child as your own, who worked this land with your bare hands, who chose duty over—" He hesitated. "Over love." Abigail finished softly. She met his eyes. "I never told you, did I? Before I married Thomas, when you first came through Jericho Pass as a young cavalry blacksmith. I loved you then." Silas went very still. "What? But Thomas needed a mother for his baby girl. He was my dearest friend, lost and grieving after Clara's mother died. When he proposed, She swallowed hard. "I chose duty, and you rode away. I thought you'd rejected me because I had nothing to offer." Silas said quietly. "Just a wandering soldier with calloused hands and dreams of a homestead." "Your hands were always strong enough," Abigail whispered. "I was the one who wasn't brave enough to follow my heart." In the quiet that followed, Silas reached across the space between their chairs. His hand found hers, rough palm against soft fingers. It was a simple touch, but it held years of unspoken feelings, of paths not taken, of hope rekindled. They sat there, hands clasped, watching the fire paint gold across their joined fingers. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking this moment when truth finally found its voice, when duty and desire no longer stood opposed, when 2 hearts long separated began to beat in time once more. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with meadowlarks singing in the cottonwoods. Abigail was hanging sheets on the line when the sound of wagon wheels caught her attention. Through the billowing white cotton, she saw Clara's familiar form sitting beside a tall, broad-shouldered young man. Her heart skipped. She hadn't expected Clara back so soon. Silas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He stood quietly as the wagon drew closer, his expression careful. The young man at the reins handled the team with practiced ease, bringing them to a gentle stop in the yard. Clara practically glowed as she climbed down, her traveling dress dusty, but her eyes bright. "Mama," she called out, hurrying forward to embrace Abigail. The scent of Denver's fancy rose water clung to her collar. "Clara, sweetheart." Abigail held her tight, then drew back to study her face. "You're home so soon. Is everything all right?" "Everything's wonderful." Clara turned to gesture at her companion. who approached with dignified grace. "Mama, this is Levi Stronghorse. He's Reverend Stronghorse's son from the Denver mission." Levi removed his hat, revealing kind eyes and features that spoke of both strength and gentleness. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice deep and measured. "It's an honor to meet you. Clara has told me so much about you." Silas stepped forward, extending his hand. "Welcome to our home, Mr. Stronghorse. Please call me Levi." He shook Silas's hand firmly. "Clara speaks highly of you as well, Mr. Boone." Clara couldn't contain her smile as she reached for the wagon. "I brought some things from Denver, new fabric for curtains, and—" She pulled out a crisp envelope. "A letter of approval from the mission board. They've offered Levi a position as translator for the Territorial Council." Abigail's eyes widened. "Clara, what exactly happened in Denver?" Clara exchanged a meaningful look with Levi, then took his hand. "Levi and I are engaged, Mama. We've known each other for months through letters and my visits to my cousins. The mission board has given their blessing." Abigail steadied herself against a fence post, overwhelmed. Clara stepped closer, her free hand reaching out to touch her mother's arm. "And Mama, I want you to know, I give you my blessing too, to marry Silas." Her voice softened. "I saw how he looked at you, even before I left. It's the same way Levi looks at me." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. She pulled Clara close, then reached for Levi's hand as well. "Welcome to our family," she whispered. Silas cleared his throat, clearly moved. "Let's get your things inside. You must be hungry after the journey." They spent the afternoon settling Levi in the spare room while Clara unpacked her Denver purchases. As the sun began to set, they gathered in the kitchen to prepare supper. Abigail taught Levi how to shape her mother's biscuit recipe, while Clara sliced fresh apples. Silas sat at the table, whittling a new handle for the butter churn. The kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of cooking. Levi worked the dough with careful attention, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. "Mrs. Johnson," he said thoughtfully, "I may be able to help with your land claim situation." Abigail paused in stirring the stew. "How so?" "I know an elder in the Cherokee Nation who once knew Clara's birth mother. He keeps careful records of family lines and land holdings from before the war." Levi shaped another biscuit. "If you'd allow me, I could write to him. His testimony about Clara's mother living here might help establish the legitimacy of your claim." "You'd do that for us?" Abigail's voice wavered. "Of course." Levi smiled gently. "Family helps family, and soon we'll be just that." Clara set down her knife and moved to embrace her mother from behind. "See, Mama? Everything's working out just as it should." Abigail leaned back into her daughter's arms, watching as Silas looked up from his whittling to meet her eyes. His gaze held such tenderness that her heart felt full to bursting. The evening light streamed golden through the windows, catching the dust motes in its glow. Here in her kitchen stood the future she'd never dared to imagine. Her beloved daughter found love with a good man who honored both his faith and his heritage. And Silas, the man she'd once let slip away, had returned to offer not just security, but a second chance at real happiness. As they gathered around the table for supper, Levi offered a prayer in both English and Comanche, his deep voice reverent. Clara's hand found his as they said, "Amen," while across the table Silas's fingers brushed against Abigail's. The simple meal before them seemed a feast, blessed by forgiveness, hope, and love freely given. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in this moment, all was right in their world. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Levi saddled his horse. The morning air held a crisp bite, promising another clear spring day. Clara stood close, adjusting his saddlebags while Abigail wrapped fresh biscuits in a clean cloth. "The elder lives 3 days' ride from here," Levi explained, securing the food in his pack. "I should return within the week, God willing." Silas emerged from the barn carrying extra rope and a canteen. "Weather looks fair for traveling. You know these trails well?" "Yes, sir. I've made this journey before." Levi's quiet confidence brought comfort to them all. He mounted his horse with practiced ease, then reached down to squeeze Clara's hand one last time. "I'll send word when I arrive." They watched him ride away, his strong figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Clara wiped her eyes, trying to hide her tears, but Abigail pulled her close. "He's a good man, sweetheart. The Lord will keep him safe." Silas didn't waste daylight. Soon he was behind the plow, turning rich earth for spring planting. The horses strained against their harnesses, steam rising from their flanks in the cool morning air. Abigail watched from the kitchen window as she kneaded bread dough, her heart full at the sight of him working their land with such care. By mid-morning, Pastor Gilroy's wife arrived with a dress box under her arm. "For Sunday," she announced, smiling warmly. "My sister's wedding dress. It should fit you beautifully, Abigail." In the bedroom, Abigail slipped the ivory cotton dress over her head. The fabric whispered against her skin, soft from years of careful storage. She smoothed her hands over the simple lace at the collar, remembering her first wedding day so many years ago. "Oh, Mama!" Clara breathed, helping with the buttons. "You look lovely." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they saw 3 riders approaching. The railroad agent, Merritt Bow, flanked by 2 rough-looking men they'd never seen before. Silas stopped his plowing and walked to meet them, his stance wary but controlled. Abigail hurried to change back into her work dress, her fingers trembling at the buttons. By the time she reached the yard, Bow was already speaking, his tone dripping with false courtesy. "Now, Mr. Boone, surely you understand our position. This land's value has increased considerably with the discovery of that aquifer. The railroad's prepared to be generous, if Mrs. Johnson cooperates." "The land's not for sale," Silas stated firmly. "And come Sunday, it'll be even more secure in her name." One of Bow's companions, a man with a nasty scar across his jaw, spat in the dirt. "That wedding ain't happening if you know what's good for you, giant." "Is that a threat?" Silas's voice remained steady, but Abigail saw his hands flex at his sides. Bow smiled thinly. "Consider it friendly advice. $500 would solve all these complications. Otherwise, accidents do happen, especially to newlyweds." The scarred man reached for his gun belt, but Silas moved faster than seemed possible for a man his size. His fist connected with the thug's jaw, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The other man started forward, but Silas's glare stopped him cold. "Get off our land!" Silas growled, his usual gentle nature hardened to steel. "Next time you come threatening a lady on her own property, I won't be so neighborly." Bow's face darkened with rage, but he maintained his composure. "This isn't over, Boone." Not by a long shot. He wheeled his horse around, his men following sullenly behind. Clara ran to Abigail, wrapping her arms around her mother's waist. They watched the riders disappear down the road, dust settling in their wake. Silas approached slowly, flexing his right hand. "Are you hurt?" Abigail touched his knuckles gently. "No, Mom." His voice softened. "But I reckon we should keep a closer watch these next few days." That evening, after supper was cleared away, they gathered in the front room. Silas sat by the fireplace, a piece of cedar wood in his hands. His knife moved carefully, deliberately, as he carved. "What are you making?" Clara asked, looking up from her mending. "A cross," he replied, smoothing a rough edge. "For the front door. My mama always said a home needs a reminder of God's protection." Abigail set aside her Bible and moved closer to watch him work. The cedar's sweet scent filled the room as curls of wood fell at his feet. His strong hands, so capable of violence when needed, shaped the sacred symbol with tender precision. When he finished, they prayed together, heads bowed in the lamplight. Abigail's voice trembled slightly as she asked for guidance and protection. Silas's deep "Amen" seemed to resonate through the very walls of their home. Later, as Clara slept and Silas took one last walk around the property, Abigail hung the cedar cross above their door. Its fresh carved surface caught the moonlight, a silent sentinel against the darkness beyond. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the April sun warming the dew-kissed grass along Johnson Creek. The old cottonwood tree spread its newly budded branches wide, as if reaching to bless the small gathering beneath. Abigail stood before her mirror, smoothing Mrs. Gilroy's borrowed dress with trembling hands. "Here, Mama." Clara stepped forward with a sprig of wild bluebells. Something blue for luck. She tucked the delicate flowers into her mother's simple, upswept hair, then kissed her cheek. "You look beautiful." Abigail touched the flowers gently. "Thank you, sweetheart." Her voice wavered with emotion. "I never thought I'd have this day again. Never thought I'd find—" She trailed off, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Love?" Clara finished softly. "It's written all over both your faces, plain as day." Outside, townsfolk began arriving in wagons and on horseback, their Sunday best bright against the prairie grass. Some came out of genuine goodwill, others from pure curiosity, but Abigail refused to let their whispers dim her joy. She watched through the window as Silas spoke with Pastor Gilroy near the creek, tall and handsome in his pressed black coat. "Ready, Mama?" Clara asked, offering her arm. Abigail nodded, squeezing her daughter's hand. Together they stepped out into the morning light. The small crowd parted, creating a path to where Silas waited beneath the cottonwood. His eyes found hers immediately, and the tenderness in his gaze made her heart skip. Pastor Gilroy opened his Bible, its worn leather catching the sunlight. "Dearly beloved," his voice carried across the quiet gathering. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Abigail barely heard the familiar words that followed. She was lost in Silas's steady presence beside her, in the warmth of his large hand as it enfolded hers. The morning breeze carried the sweet scent of wildflowers and new grass, mingling with the earthy smell of the creek. "Do you, Silas Boone, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His deep voice held absolute certainty. "And do you, Abigail Johnson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." The words came straight from her heart, clear and true. They exchanged simple gold bands, Silas's hands gentle as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Pastor Gilroy smiled broadly. "By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride." Silas leaned down, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. His kiss was tender, reverent, and full of promise. Someone in the crowd, probably young Tommy Webber, let out a whoop of celebration. The moment was broken by the sudden thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Silas tensed, moving protectively closer to Abigail, but it was Levi who emerged from the tree line, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Wait!" he called out, pulling his mount to a stop. He swung down quickly, a leather document case clutched in his hand. Clara ran to meet him, joy lighting her face. "I made it," Levi said, slightly out of breath. He pulled a rolled parchment from the case. The Cherokee elder had more than just records. He had the original land allotment deed, signed and sealed by the territorial governor himself. It confirms Clara's maternal lineage and their ancestral claim to this land. Pastor Gilroy took the document, examining it carefully. "This is official, all right? With Indian territory boundaries and everything." He looked up, beaming. "This supersedes any railroad claim. The land is yours, Mrs. Boone, legally and irrefutably." A murmur went through the crowd. Several of the townspeople who'd been standing apart moved closer, offering congratulations. Mrs. Webber wiped tears from her eyes, saying something about true love conquering all. Abigail felt Silas's arm slip around her waist, strong and steady. "Looks like we've got ourselves a double blessing today," he said softly. "The Lord provides," she whispered back, leaning into his embrace. Clara and Levi joined them under the cottonwood, their own joy evident in their bright eyes and clasped hands. The morning sun filtered through the leaves above, dappling the small family in patterns of light and shadow. "Well now," Pastor Gilroy announced, tucking the deed carefully into his Bible, "I believe there's wedding cake waiting at the house. Shall we celebrate?" The gathering moved toward the homestead, voices lifted in cheerful conversation. Abigail lingered a moment with Silas beneath the tree, their fingers intertwined. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing past my mistakes to my heart." Silas lifted their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Nothing to thank me for, Mrs. Boone. The Lord knew what he was about when he brought me back here." Together they walked toward their home, where Clara was already cutting the cake, and Levi was sharing tales of his journey. The cedar cross above the door caught the midday light, blessing all who passed beneath it with the promise of love, faith, and new beginnings. The evening settled softly over the Johnson, now Boone, homestead. Lamplight glowed warm through the windows, casting golden squares onto the packed earth outside. Inside, Abigail moved about the kitchen with quiet purpose, setting 2 cups of chamomile tea on the table where Silas sat, his large frame making the wooden chair seem small. "Still can't believe how everything turned out today," she said, settling into her seat across from him. The borrowed wedding dress hung carefully over a chair in the corner, replaced by her familiar calico. Silas reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb brushing over the new gold band. "The Lord has his ways of making things right." His voice was gentle, matching the peaceful mood of their first evening as husband and wife. "He surely does." Abigail smiled, remembering the morning's celebrations. "Did you see Mrs. Weber's face when Levi brought that deed? I thought she might faint from excitement." Their quiet laughter mingled with the soft crackle of the hearth fire. Through the window, they could see Clara and Levi sitting on the porch swing, their silhouettes close but proper, speaking in low voices about their own future plans. "They're good kids," Silas observed, sipping his tea. "Strong in faith and purpose." "Just like their parents," Abigail replied, squeezing his hand. The peaceful evening wrapped around them like a warm blanket, full of possibility and fresh starts. Neither could have guessed how quickly that peace would shatter. Dawn broke harsh and clear the next morning. Abigail rose early, as was her habit, to draw water for breakfast. Her scream brought Silas running from the barn, where he'd already been up checking the livestock. The well opening gaped dark and wrong, surrounded by scattered white crystals. The acrid smell of lye burned their nostrils. A crude warning had been carved into the wooden well housing. "Railroad gets its way. Don't touch anything," Silas warned, pulling Abigail back. He grabbed a long stick and dipped it into the well. When he withdrew it, the wood was pitted and scarred. "They've poisoned it, dumped enough lye in there to make it undrinkable for weeks." Clara and Levi emerged from the house, drawn by the commotion. "I'll ride for the marshal," Levi said immediately, already turning toward the barn. "Be careful," Clara called after him, worry creasing her brow. They might still be watching. Silas surveyed the land with hard eyes, then grabbed his shovel from where it leaned against the barn. "We need water now. Can't wait for the law. That creek runoff about 50 yards south. We can dig a temporary trench, create a holding pond." "I'll help," Clara said, reaching for another shovel, but Abigail caught her arm. "No, sweetheart. You stay close to the house. We don't know if those men are still around." The morning sun climbed higher as Silas worked, sweat darkening his shirt despite the spring chill. Abigail helped where she could, clearing rocks and brush from his path. The work was slow, the earth still partially frozen from winter. Clara paced the porch, scanning the horizon for Levi's return. "I could ride to Denver," she suggested. "The mission has influence. They could send help, maybe even lawyers." "No," Abigail's voice was firm. "We're not splitting up again. We face this together." Silas paused in his digging, leaning on his shovel. "Your mama's right. Division is what they want. Makes us easier to break." He wiped his brow with his sleeve. "Besides, That deed's ironclad. Law's on our side now. Law doesn't mean much to men who'd poison a family's water, Abigail said quietly, picking up a stone and throwing it hard toward the useless well. The sound of hoofbeats brought them all alert, but it was only Levi returning. His expression was grim as he dismounted. Marshall's out tracking horse thieves near Trinidad. Won't be back for 3 days at least. 3 days? Abigail's voice cracked with frustration. What are we supposed to do for water until then? We dig, Silas said simply, already back at work on the trench. We pray. We hold together. Clara brought out the water barrel they kept for emergencies, checking its level. We have enough stored for drinking and cooking, if we're careful. Maybe 2 days' worth. God will provide, Levi said, picking up another shovel. He didn't bring us this far to abandon us now. The family worked through the morning, taking turns at the digging. The trench slowly took shape, inching closer to the natural runoff from the creek. It wasn't ideal. The water would need boiling, and the flow would be minimal, but it would keep them going until the well could be cleaned. Around noon, Abigail called them in for a simple meal of bread and dried beef. They sat close around the table, their unity stronger for the morning's trial. Silas offered a prayer of thanks and protection, his deep voice steady and sure. We'll need to test the well water daily, he said after they'd eaten. Once the lye dilutes enough, we can start the cleaning process. Might take weeks, but we'll manage. Together, Abigail added, her hand finding his across the table. Clara nodded firmly. Together. The next 2 days stretched long and hard across the Johnson Boone homestead. Morning light found Silas already at work, his shoulders straining against the frozen earth as he deepened the water trench. The spring sun offered little warmth, and his breath clouded in the chilly air. Let me spell you for a bit, Levi offered, reaching for the shovel. Silas shook his head, determination etched in his features. Almost got it wide enough. His words cut short as the shovel struck hidden stone. The handle jerked sideways, wrenching his shoulder with a sharp crack. He stumbled, dropping to one knee. Silas! Abigail rushed from the porch where she'd been hanging wash. Her skirts kicked up dust as she ran to his side. It's nothing, he insisted, but his face was pale with pain. Just caught it wrong. Clara appeared with strips of cloth and a bottle of liniment. Together, they helped Silas to the porch, where Abigail gently worked the medicine into his shoulder. The muscle had twisted badly, though nothing seemed broken. That's enough digging for today, Abigail said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. Levi mounted his horse. I'll ride into town, see if I can't round up some help. We need more than just our hands on this. Clara touched his arm. I'll come with you. 2 voices carry further than one. They returned 2 hours later leading a small parade of wagons. 3 families from town had loaded barrels of fresh water, along with picks and shovels. Even Tom Weber, known for keeping to himself, drove his team up to the homestead. Heard what happened with your well, he said gruffly. Ain't right, poisoning a family's water. Railroad's gone too far this time. More surprising still was the arrival of Martha Tate, the woman who'd called Abigail desperate at the mercantile. She climbed down from her buggy carrying a fresh-baked loaf of sourdough bread. I spoke out of turn before, Martha said, not quite meeting Abigail's eyes. Been preying on it. When I heard about that Cherokee deed being legal and all, well, seems the Lord's hand was in this marriage after all. Abigail accepted the bread with grace. Would you like some coffee, Martha? It's fresh made. The morning's work party turned into an impromptu gathering. Women clustered in the kitchen, while men took turns at the trench. Children darted between the adults, carrying water and tools where needed. The atmosphere held something healing, as if the community itself was washing away old prejudices with each barrel of water shared. By late afternoon, Pastor Gilroy's wagon appeared on the road. He'd been in town, where he'd confronted Railroad Agent Bowe outside the telegraph office. Told him straight out, the pastor reported, accepting a cup of coffee. Said any company that poisons wells and threatens God-fearing folks will answer to both earthly law and divine judgment. Reminded him that the territory governor takes a dim view of railroad strong-arming these days. What did he say to that? Silas asked, his injured arm now properly bandaged and resting in a sling. Huffed and puffed about progress and property rights. But when I mentioned that Cherokee deed and how many witnesses saw it registered, the pastor smiled. Well, he turned about 3 shades paler. Seems he didn't expect legal documentation to surface. As evening approached, the neighbors gradually departed, leaving behind full water barrels and promises to return tomorrow. The house settled into peaceful quiet, with Clara and Levi taking their usual place on the porch swing. Inside, Abigail tucked a quilt around Silas as he sat in the rocking chair by the fire. His shoulder was still sore, but the liniment had helped considerably. "Thank you," she said softly, sitting beside him on the hearth. "For what? For standing by me through all this. For seeing worth in me when others didn't. For ... She paused, emotion catching in her throat. For loving me enough to fight for this land, this home. Silas reached out with his good arm and drew her closer. "Abigail, I've loved you longer than you know. Even back when you chose duty over your heart, I understood. Respected it, even. A woman who'd sacrifice her own happiness to raise another's child? That's the kind of love this world needs more of." Tears slipped down Abigail's cheeks as she leaned into his embrace. The firelight danced across their faces, casting warm shadows on the walls. Outside, a whip-poor-will called into the gathering dusk. "I love you," she whispered, the words carrying years of unspoken feeling. Not from duty, not from necessity, just love, pure and simple. Silas tilted her face up to his, and their kiss held all the tenderness of second chances and hard-won peace. When they parted, both were smiling through tears. "Reckon we got ourselves a proper start now," Silas said softly, pulling her close again. They sat together in the firelight, sharing the comfortable silence of hearts finally at rest. Through the window, they could hear Clara's quiet laughter at something Levi had said, and the sound wrapped around them like a blessing. The morning sun painted golden stripes across the kitchen table where Silas unfolded the telegram from the railroad's regional office. Abigail leaned close, her shoulder touching his as they read together. "Hereby retract all claims to Johnson Boone property." Silas read aloud, his deep voice steady. "We regret any distress caused by unauthorized actions of local representatives." Clara set down her coffee cup with a soft clink. "They're backing down." "Seems that way." Silas reached for a second letter, this one from his lawyer friend in Dodge City. "Tom writes here that your Cherokee lineage grants full water rights under territorial law. Says it's ironclad." Through the open window, they could see Agent Bo's wagon rolling out of town, loaded with trunks and office furniture. Folks on the street turned their backs as he passed, a clear message in their silence. "Good riddance," Levi said quietly, but without malice. That evening, as twilight softened the edges of the day, Clara found Abigail alone on the porch. The two women sat side by side, watching fireflies rise from the grass. "Mama," Clara began, her voice gentle, "I need to say something." Abigail's hands stilled in her lap. "What is it, dear? I understand now. Why you wrote those letters. Not just the desperation, but the love behind it." Clara reached over and took her mother's hand. "You've always protected me, even when it cost you everything." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. "I was wrong to deceive—" "Yes," Clara interrupted softly. "But you were right to fight for our future. I see that now, as a woman grown, not just as your daughter." They embraced, years of unspoken words flowing between them like a cleansing stream. When they pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. Later, as the family gathered for supper, Levi cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said, setting down his fork. "What if we built a chapel? something simple, halfway between town and the Cherokee mission. A place for both communities, Clara added, her eyes bright with possibility. Silas nodded slowly. Could do most of the work ourselves. Might help heal some old wounds. A house of worship, Abigail said softly, where all God's children are welcome. They sat together in the lamplight, 4 hearts beating with shared purpose, while outside the prairie wind sang of new beginnings. Spring painted the prairie in sweeping strokes of green and gold. The morning dew sparkled on new grass, and meadowlarks called from fence posts that Silas had set deep in the awakening earth. Each post marked another step toward their future, another anchor in the land they'd fought to keep. Silas wiped sweat from his brow as he studied the chapel plans spread across a rough-hewn table. Levi stood beside him, pointing to where the bell tower would rise. "Reckon we'll need extra support here," Silas said, his finger tracing the drawing. "Wind gets mighty fierce some seasons." The sound of wagon wheels drew their attention. Clara drove up in the buggy, returning from town with supplies for her summer wedding. Her smile was as bright as the wildflowers she'd gathered along the way. "Mama's already started on my dress," she announced, her eyes shining. "Says it'll have lace from Denver." Inside the house, Abigail hummed as she worked, the scent of apple and cherry pies floating through open windows. The town social was coming, and she meant to show folks that the Johnsons, now the Boones, could still set a fine table. Her hands moved with sure purpose, crimping crusts and sprinkling sugar, each motion a prayer of gratitude. As evening settled over the land, painting the sky in deep purples and blues, Abigail found Silas on the porch. She carried something in her hands, a cedar box, lovingly carved with simple flowers. "I've been meaning to give you this," she said softly. Silas took the box, his large hands gentle against the smooth wood. Inside lay a bundle of letters, tied with faded ribbon. The letters she'd written in Clara's name, born of desperation and hope. "They were lies," Abigail whispered, her voice catching. "But they led me back to truth, back to you." She touched the papers, years of longing captured in ink and paper. "I reckon it's time to let them go." Silas nodded, understanding in his eyes. Together they walked to the fire pit where embers still glowed from supper. One by one, they fed the letters to the flames. The paper curled and blackened, carrying away the weight of old guilt and shame. As the last letter burned, Silas took Abigail's hand. Above them, stars pierced the darkening sky like pinpricks of hope. The prairie wind carried the sweet scent of new grass and possibility. They stood together, watching the past turn to ash, while all around them spring promised new beginnings. Dawn broke gentle over Jericho Pass, painting the sky in soft rose and gold. Abigail's hands trembled slightly as she lit the lantern, setting it carefully in the window. The flame caught and held steady, a beacon of welcome for the day ahead. The town social would begin soon, and already she could hear the distant rumble of wagons making their way along the dusty roads. On the porch, the steady creak of Silas's rocking chair kept time with the morning birds. His big hands moved with surprising delicacy over the cedar wood, each stroke of the knife precise and purposeful. Curls of wood gathered at his feet as the cradle took shape beneath his careful touch. It wasn't meant for any child they expected, their years for that had passed, but it spoke of something deeper, the family they were building now, piece by piece, love by love. The sound of hoofbeats drew near, and Clara's laugh rang out clear as a bell. She and Levi led a small procession from the mission, their wagon loaded with fresh-baked bread and jars of preserves. Behind them came 3 more families, their children bouncing excitedly in the wagon beds. "Mama!" Clara called out, her face glowing. "Elder Joseph brought his famous berry preserves." She hurried up the path, her skirts swishing against the morning damp grass. Inside the little home, the air filled with the warmth of welcome and the mingled scents of coffee and cinnamon. Voices rose and fell like music, Elder Joseph's deep rumble mixing with the children's high laughter. Levi stood by the window, translating stories between his people and the settlers, building bridges with each shared tale. As the morning wore on, Abigail found herself by the hearth, watching her home overflow with the family they'd found. Her fingers traced the smooth wood of her chair as she began to hum, soft and low at first, then stronger. Amazing grace filled the corners of the room, and others joined in, voices weaving together like a tapestry of belonging. Silas worked steadily through it all, his hands never faltering. The cradle took its final shape under his touch, strong, sure, and beautiful in its simplicity. As he drove home the last nail, the sound rang out clear and true. Abigail moved to stand beside him, her hand resting light on his shoulder. "We built this life," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Plank by plank, love by love." The cradle stood between them, more than wood and nails. It was their testament to hope, to healing, to the family they'd forged from broken pieces and made whole again. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.